We're about to start. Welcome to this second day of this 2024 Leblanc lecture. Cette deuxième journée des conférences Hugues Leblanc 2024. Nous avons le très grand honneur d'avoir Caney, qui nous a déjà donné hier une super conférence. Et ce matin, on va avoir une deuxième conférence sur qu'est-ce qu'une transition juste vers un monde durable. Les conférences se passent aujourd'hui sur le même mode que hier, donc environ cinquantaine de minutes de présentation par Caney, puis on aura un commentaire qui sera donné par Dominique, le département de signes, et à la suite de ça, on aura la possibilité de répondre et nous prendrons ensuite les questions. La séance est aussi sur Zoom, donc je pense que pour ceux qui sont sur celles et ceux qui sont sur Zoom, ça va se passer de la même manière. Et là aussi, si vous voulez poser des questions, vous pourrez via le chat. Je mentionne le fait que la séance est enregistrée, juste pour dire. Et sans plus attendre, je vous invite à salut Caney.
Thank you once again for organizing it and coming along. So yesterday explored what we owe future generations when it comes to affecting the climate system. And I think there's a natural question that follows on from that, which is how can we transition from an unsustainable world to a sustainable one, and how can we do so in a just way? And that's the focus of this lecture. And we get to relate it to the third lecture. The third lecture is going to ask what responsibility, or who has what responsibilities to bring it about. So you might think by the end of this you'll know hopefully what a just transition might look like, but that leaves entirely open who has a responsibility to try and realize that, and that's the final lecture. Yeah, so I was saying we need to have an account of how to transition from an unsustainable world to a sustainable world, and doing so will generate various costs and harms as well as, of course, benefits. And the question at the forefront of this lecture is what's a just way of addressing those costs and harms as well as benefits. So to begin then, I want to list some but not all of the kinds of policy measures people often propose to dealing with climate change. And I am just focusing on climate change, obviously, but as Eric pointed out yesterday, it's somewhat artificial to isolate climate change and bracket out all the other kind of environmental and other challenges. But, you know, policy proposals will include things like a carbon tax or issuing permits to emit greenhouse gases, either tradable or non-tradable. They involve things like mass electrification and using electricity generated in a clean way to power lots of things like lighting, computers, and so on. A massive deployment of renewables like solar, wind, hydroelectric, wave, tidal, biofuels. You can read all of that. So I'm not saying that's exhaustive, but that's some of the things that people put on the table. And in maybe almost every case, there are going to be some potential downsides and some costs or harms. So, you know, if we're going to decarbonize the economy and phase out fossil fuel-based industries, then of course that will, unless something else is done, result in loss of jobs and employment. Many companies invested in fossil fuels, so decarbonisation is going to result in what people call stranded assets. So lots of investors have put huge amounts of money into fossil fuel exploration. If it's phased out, they're going to lose those resources. You might think that's too bad, you know, who cares about those, but lots of academics should care about that because their pensions are often invested in this. That still might mean that the right answer is, yeah, too bad. You take the risk, you get that kind of cost, but it's just flagging up there are losses there. Carbon tax can unless you do something else about it, result in fuel poverty and pricing poor people out of being able to heat their homes. Feed-in tariffs is a system where citizens generate electricity, let's say through wind turbines or solar panels, and sell it back to the state. And in some countries, I think Germany, and also earlier iteration in the UK, the state would subsidize this. But they are regressive, because the only people who could afford to do this were generally middle class, and they got paid by the national grid, meaning the general energy consumer, including people too poor or to buy any renewable energy. Many people are really keen on electric cars and so on and so forth, but they rely on batteries, and batteries rely on minerals and extraction of rare earth minerals, or cobalt, or lithium, or nickel, or copper. These are often extracted in extremely hazardous ways. So if we take cobalt, for example, the Democratic Republic of the Congo has a huge amount of resources of cobalt. It's extracted often by small children with very little protection, pittance of a salary, and they have high levels of toxicity exposure doing that. If we think of lithium, that's used again in lithium-ion batteries, but lithium requires an awful lot of water. And if you look in Chile, in the north, in the Atacama Desert, then there's a lot of lithium, but there are controversies with local people about all the water being channeled towards this. Wind farms, there are conflicts between indigenous peoples across the world over the location of wind farms. Biofuels hike the price of crops up. The crop is used for fuel rather than food. Electric is obvious, can involve displacement. And nuclear is also obvious, the health risks of nuclear waste. Now, none of these are supposed to be like clincher objection saying we shouldn't do any of these because we have an imperative to deal with climate change. But they do fall into the category of, some of them I would call, and this is a terminology I'm borrowing from Henry Shue, some of them are cost, so they are a negative feature attached to it that it could be outweighed. Some of them you might just think are harm, people are being wronged in certain ways, they're being ill-treated, and so that people being paid a pittance of a salary, or who are in effect being forced to work in dangerous conditions, you might think that's not a disadvantage so much as people are being wronged by that. So the challenge is, can these be designed in ways that mitigate any wrongs or compensate for harms and costs? Or maybe it's just a timeline, or maybe it was your present. So I think it's useful here to have a distinction between two ways in which these costs and harms can be generated. One is living on fossil fuels for people who are having stranded assets or who are employed in fossil fuel dependent industries. Their costs are generated, whatever else you do, just by getting off fossil fuels. But then there are other ones which are to do with adopting alternative energy sources. So if you are having mass electrification, then you will encounter some of those costs and harms. So there's like two levels at which there can be generation of these disadvantages or burdens. Look, my question then is, how do we negotiate this in a just way? How do we decarbonize the world, but distribute any benefits or burdens equitably? And I'm going to appeal to 5 values, although the last one is really 2 under one heading, but maybe I should do this as 6. And we'll see whether that persuades you. So the first value, or principle, is one that's really widely shared amongst people working on climate justice and environmental justice. And in effect, says that those who are causally responsible for creating a problem should bear some of the cost for addressing that problem. I think a nice way of formulating it is a paper by Henry Shue, in 1999, where he talks about contribution to the problem. And it's a really powerful intuition. If you saw me on the way here with some food in my hand and a wrapper, and I finished it and I just tossed the wrapper behind me, you'd think I've made a mess. And as Henry Shue often puts it, those who create the mess ought to clear it up, pay for the clearing of it up. And underlying it, I think there's an idea of responsibility, of holding agents responsible for their actions. We'll have to qualify for reasons I want to specify later. There are different versions of it, but no one, to my knowledge, really throws this out and says, I just don't think this has a role to play. But I suppose one issue is how you operationalize it. And the way that many people operationalize it is they make two assumptions, and Henry Shue does this. They think the primary agents they are talking about are countries, and they think that contributing to the problem is equivalent to emitting greenhouse gases. And so if you attend or participate in or watch climate protests or read anything like that, they will say it's affluent industrialized countries that have caused the problem, these countries, and they will marshal these facts and figures about how much each country has emitted or their factor emissions per country. And you can see why people do that. But the first thing I want to say is, although I endorse a responsibility principle, I don't think we should adopt those two assumptions. When we're thinking about a just transition globally, I think it's worth unpacking the country, and I think it's worth querying the equation of contributor to the problem and emitting greenhouse gases. So first thing. So, we've a long time reading a lot of the literature in the social sciences on climate policy and the determinants of global warming from the point of view of the political science. And here's a list of some of the agents I think contribute to the problem. So governments, obviously, through their energy policy, through their use or non-use of taxes, through their use of subsidies, because many governments subsidize the consumption of fossil fuels, through their use of regulations or non-use of regulations. And they massively affect how much their citizens, companies within their, through the design of towns and cities, the more dispersed a town is, then the higher the emissions are going to be. So it's a causally relevant agent that's going to be really hard to deny. I will describe later on some policies that the UK government has adopted which illustrate it. Second, individuals have some agency. If individuals had no agency whatsoever, then they would be off the hook, but people can make choices about diet, about their lifestyles. Third category is firms, so fossil fuel companies, people like Leah Stokes and Matthew Milner have pointed out the ways in which they have profoundly shaped energy policy in the US and diluted and exposed any climate legislation. So that contributes to the problem. Even if they're not themselves emitting anything, a full causal account of why there is this problem would say, oh, these agents blocked and thwarted attempts to mitigate climate change. Maybe less well known for some people is trade unions. So Mildenberger's book is called, what's it called actually? But the key concept is called, he talks about double representation. He says that carbon has representation from capital and labor, because many trade union workers are in industries that are dependent on fossil fuels. And so in his study of Norway, Australia, and the US, he says, trade unions have often blocked it. I think it's called carbon capture, but I could be getting that one wrong. Building companies is an interesting one, and this is from a Guardian article by a journalist who found out that US utilities were paying building companies to design houses fitted with gas appliances. So they were steering consumers into using gas rather than renewables. So I think that should feature in the causal account. And then the final category is investors, and people like Brett Christopher's Newell have sort of pointed out the amount of money being spent investing in fossil fuel extraction. a lot of several books of energy transitions and various factors, including finance, in making these possible. So someone says to me, who is like contributing to the problem? This is my first stab at a look at some of the relevant actors. So that means if we're going to say, look, those who are contributing to the problem ought to pay, we need to have something more fine-grained than this talk of our individuals are or states are. We also need to, let's put some figures on it. So we think about the banks and investors. These were some of the figures that a group of NGOs collated. RBC, is that Royal Bank of Canada? Yes. So I didn't choose that. But you can see the amounts of money being spent. And 2016 is when the Paris Agreement won. Right? So after these countries committed to 2 degrees and as close as possible to 1.5. And the next figure is, I think, amazing about how much money has been invested in continuing extraction. So it seems to me, if someone says, who's contributing to the problem, anything that doesn't include these actors is being missed. But also, and let's go on to the second one about how you contribute to the problem. So I don't think it's probably complete, but here are like 5 ways in which actors can contribute to the problem. So the UK government in the last decade de facto banned the construction of new onshore wind farms. And what they did was put planning regulations in place such that if one person within the vicinity objected, it couldn't go ahead. So the number of applications went down by 96% after they introduced that. I think that's contributed to the problem, but it's not by omitting, it's by making it harder for people not to emit. And the extreme case is when you do that for every energy source. So you make it harder to use solar, and you make it harder to use hydroelectric, and you make it harder to use wind. It seems to me the causally relevant agents there are not the householders burning the energy so much as the others who are writing the script that others have to conform to. The building companies, I think, are in the third category. It's not impossible if you buy a house fitted for gas to try and get it adjusted so that you could use renewables, but it's harder, and you're nudging people. And that I think is a kind of contribution to the problem that is not, it's not the same as harming, it's making non-harming less likely to occur. Another way you can contribute to harm is enabling. So think about someone with a gun shooting people, that they're reliant on someone else providing them with bullets. The person supplying the bullets is the enabler. And in a really strong situation, the strong condition would be something like the person can't shoot the gun without the bullets. The analogous one here would be someone who cannot, a company that cannot extract unless they get the money. So if these banks are providing money without which the extraction couldn't go ahead, then to be slightly provocative, they are akin to the person providing the bullets to someone without whom they couldn't fire the gun. And then, it's another way you could contribute to the problem, which is just sowing misinformation and deceiving people. Are people familiar with Dieselgate here, or should I say a little bit about it? I think maybe not everyone is nodding. And so this is when I think it was Volkswagen originally, but it wasn't. Then were accused of tampering with the testing devices that tested how low carbon the cars were. So people bought cars in good faith, thinking that they were very low emissions. But the cars have been designed in such a way that when they're on the road, they blasted out lots of greenhouse gases, but in the testing area, they didn't. And I think the case is upheld against Volkswagen. But let's just, because I'm not confident I know all the facts and figures there, let's just stylize it and say, were that to be the case, then that is contributing to the problem. And I don't think ascribing liability there to the car owner seems to me remiss, rather than those who are engineering the situation such that they're causing the problem. So I'm just trying to bring a bit of sophistication or fine-grainedness into the picture and say, contribution to the problem is a relevant principle. It's really hard, I think, to let go of that really powerful guiding intuition. It has to be properly applied. And so when people talk about who should pay for dealing with transition. They often what individuals ought to do, but I think, well, look, let's take these banks and investors, and you saw the enormous sums of money involved, purely on a contribution to the problem principle. They should bear a considerable amount of burden. Now, if someone asks me, can you quantify it? I have to honestly and candidly say, no, I can't. I have not yet thought of a way in which you can like divide and apportion liability in these cases. It's really hard to think about how you could do it. You might try and do it in terms of measuring causal contribution, but the philosophical literature on this that I've read is quite skeptical of the possibility of doing that. One thing you could do, just to be very practical, is say that lots of these banks and investors will have stranded assets and they have no claim for compensation here because they were knowingly and deliberately funding things, maybe making necessary conditions to occur. They have no claim for compensation for the losses there. So there's a very practical upshot there. This one I'm not quite sure about, but I'll mention it and then we'll see what you think. So you might think those who thwarted climate legislation and spent lots of money doing this, they should also foot the bill. There would be nothing unjust about high taxation on them. I think it's complicated because one thing I think which I haven't said so far is contribution to the problem may not be exactly right. You might think, oh, and I've argued elsewhere that it should be unjust contribution to the problem. But sometimes, really poor people, they might contribute to the problem of burning fossil fuels to heat themselves, but you might think that's justified because they have rights to meet their various core needs, and if there's no other way to do it, that might be contributing to the problem, but justified. Now, if you think something that's right, then you will think there's unjust contribution to the problem and just contribution. And then so you have to say that their contribution to the problem was unjust here. And I can imagine someone saying, I don't think it is. If it was done in ways that disrupted the democratic process, then yes. But if people are just spending lots of money advertising certain opinions and putting them out there, and not violating anyone's rights, and if they happen to be very successful at persuading the citizenry, then what they're doing in itself is not unjust. I haven't really resolved my own views on that, and in some cases I think what was happening was just clearly incompatible with democratic principles, and so I do think it was unjust. And if you agree with that, then you will endorse that second one, but I do think it's not straightforward. And then if we apply the contribution principle the other way around and think, well, who shouldn't pay, then I think generally it's the poor and vulnerable, because if you just look at emissions, and I'm not saying emissions don't count, of course they count, but they're not the only thing. If you look at emissions, then you'll see kind of facts and figures from Thomas Piketty and Lucas Chancel about the distribution and the distribution of the top 1% of emitters or the top 10%. So, if you just apply the responsibility principle on its own and no other ones, it seems like it comes to that, from each according to their ability to pay is that's the kind of conclusion it's going to drive at. But I want to move on to a second value. I think it's really implausible to apply responsibility principles abstractly in isolation from the other parts of a theory or society. So when, for example, thinkers like John Rawls or Ronald Dworkin think, agents should be held responsible for their choices, they mean within a fair background structure, within a fair distribution of resources and opportunities. And that second bit is really crucial, because otherwise, imagine you've got the case here of a poor person who can develop only through the use of fossil fuels, and an affluent person who has other energy sources available but chooses to use fossil fuels. If you just look at contribution to the problem, you can't see any difference between those two. But there's clearly, I think, an immense difference between those two because their circumstances are different. The first one had no other options available. So then we have to ask ourselves, well, what is fair distribution or fair background? So that's the thought. If we think that the extent to which agents can be held responsible depends on whether they've got a fair share of resources and opportunities, you need to have some background idea of the fair share of resources and opportunities. And that is a huge question. So I don't propose to develop a long argument defending a particular view. I'm just going to put my view on the table and say, look, in my view, agents should be held responsible to some extent on whether there is a fair distribution judged by equality. So let's suppose someone is extremely poor and they are using the most logically sustainable ways of lifting themselves out of poverty, but they still might emit some greenhouse gases. I don't think that should be held against them because they're entitled to a higher standard of living. They're entitled to an equal standard of living. Whereas someone who's way above the equal shares would be fully penalised for their emissions. They can't say, I need this to attain the standard of living to which I'm entitled. Please note this like this. I know there's a lot of text on there, but that's because I really wanted to get the caveat that this does not give carte blanche to developing countries or the poor to say, well, you said the responsibility applies when there's a fair background distribution, there's an unfair background distribution, so we can just use all the fossil fuels we want to get ourselves up. That's just not true. They have a duty to do that in the least harmful, most ecologically sustainable ways. But if those are being denied to them, so if, for example, they lack clean energy or they lack access to renewables, then from my point of view, it's hard to, if it's fair to ascribe burdens to them for that, burdens to all of others who are not supplying them fair share of resources. But the main point, let me just get back to this. The main point is, of course, lots of people aren't egalitarians. They could just put in another principle like, I think agents should be held responsible within sufficientarian background where everyone has enough. So that's what I mean by this clause here. The point is just, you cannot use the responsibility principle on its own. You must nest it in a more general account of people's entitlements. So then just to spell out the implications, this would mean that if there's a carbon tax on fuel, then the proceeds should be distributed in such a way that the least advantaged are not punished by that they're not deprived of what they need to heat their homes or engage in important activities of life. It means if we invest in renewables or clean technology or energy efficiency initiatives, then the costs for these should not be borne by the poor, but by the most affluent. The story is just the same throughout, but let's suppose we look at things like renewables and minerals. It means, suppose electrification is necessary, and suppose that requires the use of these minerals like cobalt and lithium. That suppose is quite a big suppose, because others argue, oh, there are substitute ways of doing it, or these things like car driving should be reduced and minimized, and so it's not necessary to use mineral. But let's suppose that it's not possible to reduce consumption in appropriate ways, and let's suppose there aren't alternatives, there aren't substitutes. Let's suppose it is then necessary, then at the very least they would have to be extracted in ways that minimize any harm to the least advantage. And here's a slightly polemical aside. Often meet people campaigning for a just transition, and they say it's great because renewables are so cheap now. And I wonder, well, why are they cheap? Could it be that the workers are being underpaid and exploited in that process? And that's not acceptable. It's not acceptable to have a just transition that externalizes the costs onto the most vulnerable of the world. And another, I've talked about minimizing harm, but another kind of version of this would be to say, if you're going to, let's say, impose burdens on people who are disadvantaged, then you should do it in ways that involve benefit sharing and transmission of, let's say, the benefits of a new energy plant could be such that those who live nearby get reduced, fees for using the energy, or even get free energy. Otherwise, what you're doing is saying we need a transition, and although these people are really or disadvantaged, that doesn't register, and we don't propose even greater harm to them. I think that is not just. So that's the second principle. I don't know why my computer chooses some of these images, but I did get to this one because it sort of fitted the words. I want to move on to a third value. So many egalitarian liberals like myself do think agents can be held responsible for their action, but subject to various provisos. Proviso number one is probably an epistemic one, that people not be penalised if they're excusably ignorant of some of the harm they've done. And then the second proviso is they have sufficient choice. Otherwise, the choice is a significant background condition. And that informs this next point. So people often want to hold individuals responsible for their emissions. And they do it in two ways. One is they issue injunctions to people and they say, lead your own personal life in a low emissions kind of way. Or the second way they do it is to say, oh, look, the state can just tax people who emit a lot. And that's passing the burden on to the individual. And in many cases, that might be entirely fair, but I want to outline these 6 structural factors that I think, that this image of the autonomous agent who's the agent who could be held liable for, in quotes, their emissions needs to be severely qualified. So here are the 6 factors. Yeah, maybe I should just say one background point about the empiric. So I do sometimes think empirics are useful because people have a mental picture in their mind of a principle. So they kind of think, oh, look, there's this autonomous individual, we can hold them responsible. And they have a sort of philosophical anthropology or kind of a mental image. And I think the only way often to shape that is to present empirical facts that say this does not correspond with the way the world is actually working. So, number one, people's emissions will often be a function of how dense or how interspersed the urban environment is. Let's suppose they're a couple and let's suppose they have 2 kids. How much they emit will be a function of how near the nearby schools are, how near their workplaces are, how near the shops are, how near the recreation places are. And the further you stretch that out and then you generalize it for every single inhabitant of that, you're going to have much higher emissions than identical people in a place that is much more densely packed. And there was a really interesting study I saw of Atlanta in the US compared with Barcelona. And I think the transport emissions in Atlanta are 10 times the person that of people in Barcelona. And they claimed this was just because of the way the cities were organized. In Atlanta, you had to drive everywhere. So you can see that figure from Lucas Chancel. It relates to a second point, which is how much an individual emits will be a function of the transport system, like the public transport system. It'll be a function of the design of buildings, which is something that individuals, unless they're extremely affluent, have no choice over. They can't go in a house and say, I'd like it built for us. It'll be a function of the waste disposal system, whether it's recycled and reused, or there's a circular economy or not. This one is maybe a bit controversial. It might be a function of the social norms. One reason it might be controversial is people can say, look, X might be stigmatized, but that doesn't make people not do it. But often I think social norms are kind of coercive. And so here's one example of this. So I read a book by an economist called Robert Frank on the role of social norms, and he has a chapter on car consumption, and he chronicles the rise of SUVs in America. And it's just gone up hugely. And he says it's because the norms are contagious and people want to keep up. But another thought occurred to me, which was often by Europeans who moved to the States. They said they're terrified, they have to drive, given the infrastructure, they're terrified of driving a small car with these huge tanks beside them everywhere. And so as soon as there was a norm of people getting cars, it felt hazardous to others to be pedestrians, certainly cyclists, but also small car users. And so they felt pressurized to get something, but this is their story anyway. They felt pressurized to get something more robust for physical safety because an SUV into another car. The people in the SUV are much safer. So that's a way in which norms are very powerful. Well, norms about diet, there are certain parts of the United Kingdom where a vegan diet not particularly practiced, and if there was a change in norms, then there would be greater supply, and those who want to eat vegan would actually be able to get some food. But that's where some people are actually being constrained by the prevalence of norms. The reason I put Andre Gortz is because I think he had a fascinating view about cars, which he said initially people buy them because they thought they're emblematic of freedom. It's fantastic. The bad thing was for those people who did that was everyone else, well, that was great too, and they got the money to do it. And then they designed roads to fit the dominance of the car. But then when you have the roads, people think I need to have a car to get to where I am because there are roads. The public transit has atrophied. So you kind of got the enthusiasm for the car, the construction of the roads, and the looking of the roads generating the demand for the car, and it's like a vicious cycle. And then it just seems, if someone says, I'm just not going to do this, then to some extent, I just don't think that's possible. Certainly, there are long distances involved. So, the social norms, and then obviously background technology. So people cannot use solar or hydroelectric, wind, or others just don't supply it. And so all of these are supposed to kind of have two implications. One is that many of the determinants of an individual's so-called ecological footprint are beyond their control. And then it's inappropriate, I think, to hold them fully liable for effect. In the UK, there's a climate change committee. It's a really good body of experts, and they advise the government. But they said something to me which revealed the importance of this, which is they said, look, you citizens can do things on your own to lower emissions. For example, you could buy an electric car and use that. And I thought, my understanding is electric cars are about £30,000, which is way out of the price bracket for a lot of citizens. And they can't drive them in many places because there aren't the places where you can charge them. So the so-called individual choice was actually dependent on a background infrastructure of charging points. So we cannot just use the responsibility principle ascribed to individuals, which is the bottom line here. And then more positively, well, we do need to find some agents to hold responsible for this. So it might be that if the relevant causal process is at the city level, speaking about urban design, about public transit, then it's important to have an agent at that level that can be held responsible. And it's important then to have a fully democratic process so that we say, oh, look, the city of Montreal, or the city of Newcastle, the city of Birmingham, if it's got high emissions, it could be held liable, and its citizens could be held liable for those decisions. So where you have this kind of structural process, you have to, I think, create an agent, or if you're lucky, have an agent in place who can be held responsible. So we need a democratic decision on all of these structural factors. So the claim is, I think Charles Taylor once talked about a phenomenon that were irreducibly social. I think these factors are irreducibly social. You can't individualize them, but then we just cannot let them be held unaccountable. So that's why we need democracy. And lots of different things, canvas for things like energy democracy, which is towns, cities, locales, having autonomous control over their energy system. They can't just decide how much energy to emit, they can decide how they're going to be sustainable. Okay, how much time do I have left? Can I just check?
12 minutes.
Okay, excellent, good. There were two other values I want to put on the table that I think are less controversial. No, this is less controversial. Maybe the last one is more controversial. So liberty often doesn't feature in these debates, but I think I have a sort of two premise argument that you can see there. So I do think there's multiple different ways of realizing sustainability at a societal and global level. There's no uniquely single correct way of achieving it. And given this, and given that people have an interest in the freely self-determining agents, I think it's important that measures to achieve transition, allow people to choose their particular path. So, it's crucial. They don't have the choice as to whether to live within ecological limits, but I do think they should have a choice as to how they live within those limits. And I say this because some people are very prescriptive, and they say things like, each couple may only have one child. The Sarah Connolly book, One Child. Christine Overall had a book which wasn't talking about coercively limiting, but it was arguing that a couple are entitled to have 2 children. Of course, there's huge kind of problems here as to how you define a couple and what you do if people have a series of different partners and so on and so forth. But the point I want to make about liberty is I just don't think it's productive or fruitful to say people, to have a just transition, people must do it in a particular kind of way. And so I've criticized those who write on population, that they tend to say, yeah, we're going to ignore all the stuff about changing energy systems. We're going to ignore all the stuff about redesigning towns and cities. And we're going to ignore all of that. And we're going to say, the way you've got to do it is have restrictions on like 1 child per family unit. I think that view could be correct if you thought none of the other things would work. That's just not plausible. But also, it would seem to me very unjust because it makes no differentiation as to how much people have omitted or contributed in the past. And especially if you apply this globally, which people often do want to apply it, it would seem grotesquely unjust to people who've had extremely low emissions lifestyles to be told, yeah, it's not to do with Western consumerism or high emissions standards. We're going to make sure that everyone complies with this. So I don't think restrictive policies like that are the way forward. Okay. Maybe I could just say one other final thing. Sometimes this leads people to think what you should have is a system of environmental permits, like a card like this, and you can emit a certain amount. And others, kind of like Ed Miliband, who's the Minister for the Environment in the UK, who was the same position 15 years ago, once floated with it. I don't think that necessarily follows. I don't think that's necessarily the right way to do it. We can come on to that into Q&A, but those who defend this often say this is a way of realizing liberty. And when making a policy proposal like that, you have to think what way you go wrong. I'll leave that there though. So far it's been very anthropocentric, and it said like a just transition is one guided by these 4 values of responsibility, equality, democracy, liberty. What about non-anthropocentric values? Should they inform this? So imagine you're constructing fields of solar panels. Should you be worried? You think this disfigures the natural environment? Or policy measures, suppose you build a hydroelectric dam and that involves destroying lots of flora and fauna, or suppose it destroys the prospects of wildlife. I'm pretty sympathetic to that claim, Valify. And the way I think about it is a non-climate case, which is Henderson Island in the South Pacific, and study I read of it. And this is miles and miles away from any other human beings. Okay, and it has, as you can see, over 37 million plastic items on this tiny island, and it's things like Coke bottles, footballs, beach balls, straws, lots of microplastics. And one of the effects it has is the effects on all the animals, and you can see figures about animal species at extinction because of ingesting things like plastics. If you want to, you can find images online of island and wildlife there struggling. So my intuitive reaction to this is appalling and unacceptable. You might think, oh look, this would have some knock-on implications for human life, but I think that's implausible in this case, and it doesn't really seem to be explaining of the response. I think the only way to respond to the thing that many people find it unattractive and somewhat grotesque, is they're distressed by the impact on non-human animals. They think this is not a way to treat non-human animals. There's no justification for this callous disregard for their life. That's one non-anthropocentric value, non-human animal life. And the second is, and here I'm going to channel something of Thomas Hill when he wrote a paper on human excellences in the natural world. It just seemed hubristic, it seemed arrogant to treat the world as a gigantic dustbin in which we just throw our waste. And that's the case even if it doesn't have any adverse impacts on human beings, even if it doesn't have any adverse on non-human animals. The attitude exemplified, he thought, betokened a certain kind of arrogance, and that's a terrible character vice. His example, if I remember rightly, was redwood trees. So someone thinks, I'm just going to chop them down. They might be 150 years old. His reaction was, what kind of person would do that? I share that. I am not giving you much of an argument. I'm just trying to elicit intuitions. I am curious. I'm going to take an opinion poll, if you don't mind, and ask for people to put up their hand. So who is distressed by the impact on non-human animals, in this example? You put up your hand. There's a process of selection, right? Events like this. And who would think just there's something that nature has an intrinsic value here, which is
For nature in general, or the natural individual?
I mean, the islands. Let's suppose there were no animals there, and you think, would your reaction be one of moral shock or horror, thinking this is not the right way to treat the ecosystem? Maybe. So
Let's so.
I think
The dog.
it's something I didn't pose the question at all clearly, but so there's definitely some sympathy for thinking non-human animals claims should go in there, but less for the and nature having intrinsic value. So that will complicate things though, because it might tip the scales against certain projects. I'm running out of time, I'm afraid. Minutes left.
Yeah.
So I've given you some values, 5 values, or maybe 6 if you grade the philosophy degree, that should inform a just transition. I just want to end with a challenge, because some people say, well, it's all very well and very nice, but it's really important to prevent climate change, and you can't jointly prevent climate change and honour these values. They clash, and preventing dangerous climate change takes priority. And many people have said this, but I'm going to look at John Broome in particular, because we're a philosophy event, and John is a philosopher. And he wrote this after the Copenhagen Agreement of 2009, which was a significant failure. There wasn't an agreement, major text. And what he argued was, fossil fuel companies are extremely powerful, and they're not going to go away unless they are appeased or bribed or compensated. And so he thought it's unjust in one sense to do it. It's distributively unjust because he thinks the polluter could pay. But he also thinks it's more important to protect the climate system. And it's nested within a bigger argument where he says you can prevent climate change and everyone be a winner, because the original training is economist, and he thinks there is a Pareto superior alternative to the current one. So we can mitigate climate change. It will generate extra benefits. We can use those benefits to give it to fossil fuel companies to bribe them to stop doing it. In the same way that some countries, in England did this, was pay people who owned slaves to hand over their slaves. And so they are no worse off than before. So he doesn't make that analogy, but others do. Now, I mean, there's lots of things to say about this argument, and maybe the conclusion is correct. But I don't think his argument gets us there, because he rests on an empirical assumption that he has no political science kind of literature engagement on it. And this is partly because he wrote in 2010 when it was much less. But I think he still holds this argument. And there's a big literature by some names I've already mentioned, that says it is possible to have a just transition and win elections. And part of their point is that a just transition will generate losers within a society, but also winners, and that the trick to do it is indeed, as John says, to have compensation, but it's to have compensation to, let's say, workers in coal country, so they're not disadvantaged. So people, this one is on India and the US, and compensating areas where the population is hugely dependent on working in fossil fuel industries. This one is on Spain, and I'm doing something in coal country there. So I'm not going to rehearse all of their empirical claims. I just want to draw attention to there's an empirical assumption made that it's not possible to transition in a politically feasible way, which involves homogenizing the population and saying everyone is going to be a loser from an energy transition. And the reply is that's just not true. People will win the clean air, or because they have green jobs, or perhaps because they have financial compensation, perhaps because they have reinvestment in their area. So I don't think the conclusion holds. I do think that if you look at the global level, it is a different story. You know, if you're thinking about countries like Bangladesh or any countries that are exposed to climate change already, is it politically feasible to get adequate loss and damage and adaptation and mitigation for there? There's no equivalent to this argument at the global level to my knowledge yet. But within countries, I think it's too quick. Okay, so that's a summary, and talked for quite a long time, so I'll stop there. Those are the 5 values. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we're going to have a commentary by Dominique Lédé. Dominique est sur Zoom. Donc Dominique est professeur au département de philosophie ici. Elle enseigne la philosophie politique et la philosophie du droit. En philosophie politique, ses travaux portent sur la théorie de la démocratie, de la délibération publique. En philosophie du droit, elle s'intéresse au pluralisme juridique, m'a-t-elle dit, et dans le contexte des rapports entre l'État canadien et les peuples autochtones. Elle est membre du groupe de recherche interuniversitaire en philosophie politique, le GRIP, qu'on remercie aussi pour nous soutenir dans cet événement, et était jusqu'à tout récemment directrice du Centre de recherche sur la diversité et la démocratie, le CRIDA. My detailed version quickly. Dominique Lédé is a professor here in the Department of Philosophy, political philosophy. Research focuses on the theory of democracy, public deliberation. In philosophy of law, she's interested in legal pluralism in the context of relations, especially between the state and Aboriginal peoples. Without much. Okay, Dominique.
Oui, super.
15 minutes.
Yeah, 15 minutes, je me dis après. So thank you very much, Professor Caney, Simon, for this wonderful lecture. And so we've had 5 values that have been presented to us and that should guide us in distributing the costs, the benefits, the burdens, in trying to achieve a just transition to a decarbonized economy. Now, the 5 values not have the same weight in Simon Caney's argument. Actually, I think that the most important part of the argument is with responsibility, equality, and democracy, and I will focus my comments on that part of the lecture. I will then raise a question on the place of the 2 non-anthropological values in the argument, and I will end my comments with a question about the level at which Caney has decided to discuss climate justice. So first, responsibility, equality, and democracy. So let me briefly first sum up Caney's argument. The first value that should guide us in distributing the costs is responsibility. So roughly, the idea that those responsible for causing the mess that we find ourselves in should bear a greater share of the burdens involved in the transition. Caney argues, however, that responsibility cannot on its own answer the question, under what circumstances does the responsibility principle apply? It is, as he says, incomplete. Two other values are needed to answer this question, and the first value is equality, and the second one is democracy. So concerning equality, Caney argues that the responsibility principle needs to be supplemented with an account of people's fair share. So the extent to which agents can be held responsible for their emissions depends, in part, on whether they have had a fair share of resources and opportunities. And the second value that is important here is democracy. Individuals should not be held responsible for emissions over which they have little control, since the size of an individual's ecological footprint is depends largely on structural factors like the existence of a public transport system, etc. Then he should only be held liable if he's part of a collective that exercises control over those structural factors. So he argues that for there to be a just transition, these structural factors need to be the subject to democratic control of all those whose lives are governed by these factors. So the first one is, why is responsibility incomplete? And as he explained in this lecture, most people find this approach to be intuitively attractive, and a lot of people like Shu will tend to say that states should be held responsible. Okay, this is first drawn to states, and we tend to focus our attention also on gas emissions. Now, Caney wants to show us that the who and the what question are much more complicated than it is usually assumed. And so concerning the who question, he tells us that states are not the only unit of responsibility. Firms, unions, etc., are also important. Now, I don't want to challenge that exactly, but it seems to me, and it's a question that I would like to ask you, whether you do not think that states do have a primary responsibility in the sense that they are responsible for the basic legal framework in which other agents act. So that would be a first question. I know that in another article, you argue that it would be legitimate to focus attention on states only if one establishes that other possible units of analysis collapse into it. So I guess you think that that's not the case, or so, I would like you to elaborate a little bit on that. And I also follow you in the way that you want to complexify the what question, but then I guess my worry is that you are going to make the application of principle of responsibility so complicated that maybe we lose that principle. So, but of course, the argument is that what you want to show in the lecture is that the only way to make the principle of responsibility applicable is that if we go towards those two other values, which are equality and democracy. So if we look at the argument on equality, I think that what you have here is the argument that you've made often, and I think it's an important argument against what is called sometimes the isolationist view. So the view that we should consider the issue of climate change on its own, and that we isolate that view from other issues like poverty, trade, colonialism, or whatever. And Caney has defended a view that he calls integrationism, holding that it is best to treat the ethical issues posed by climate change in light of a general theory of justice and in conjunction with other issues such as poverty, development, etc. So I think that the discussion of the value of equality here is just Caney trying to make his argument for integration, L'intégrationnisme. And I think that's basically right. I am completely sympathetic. So that's here that the challenge comes. That's here I would like to discuss the challenge that you raised at the end of the lecture. Because the challenge says, and that's one of the main arguments in favor of the isolationist view, and it's a pragmatic objection. And it's simply to say, you know, if you try to confront at the same time other issues like poverty, historical oppression, fair trade, along with climate change, then, well, you're never going to do anything. You're going to be stopped in your track. And that's the argument that Room makes when he says that we may end up having to accept that rich Western countries will not get a fair share, or that fossil fuel corporations will not be there. So Caney's response to this challenge is to deny the assumption that our chances of success are increased if we isolate climate issues from other issues of justice. On the contrary, climate policies will succeed only if they are part of a wider program towards more justice. So it is the case, it's true at the international level, but it's also true at the national level, Caney tells us, because people affected by the transition to a decarbonized economy are more likely to accept the transition's negative implications for them if they receive fair compensation, or if they feel that they've been treated justly. So Caney gives us a few examples of that. So I think it's very important to show that there should be no need to choose between la fin du mois et la fin du monde. I think that's true. And it's a crucial point to make, especially now when you have populist parties on the right who try to convince people, less affluent people or working class people, that mitigation policies are a luxury that they can't afford. But some argue that there are important limits to the kind of policies that governments within the confines of a market economy can envisage to lessen the costs of climate transition for the less affluent. Because, say, the governments fear that this will impact on the competitiveness of the economy or whatnot. And so if that is the case, then workers in the fossil fuel sector, for instance, are perhaps right to be suspicious of most promises of fair transition. Is this an issue on which philosophers like Caney, who work within the framework of a liberal theory of distributive justice, should have something to say? And at the end of your entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, you have a really nice paragraph where you say that taking climate justice seriously may have major implications for economic institutions and ideologies, as well as for political institutions. Some critics of the status quo believe that capitalism cannot cope with climate change, etc., etc. And then you say that we can begin to address such claims with the help of the social sciences, including economics and political economy. And then you write the following: but philosophical analysis has its part to play, and without an understanding of climate justice will act a compass to guide us. So I wonder if you could say a bit more about how you see the relation between the kind of normative theorizing that you do and social science like political economy. So how can a philosophical analysis, as you see it, provide a compass to guide us? Should it have something to say about the basic economic framework within which we are confronted? That goes back a little bit to yesterday. So I'll have to go very fast. So on democracy, I guess my question is, what counts as democratic control? How much control is necessary before we can hold collectives responsible for the structural factors that determine their levels of emission? And it's not simply a question of level, so the country, the city, etc. But for instance, is free and fair elections enough? If free and fair elections are enough, then we are collectively responsible. We are responsible for our emissions, in whether we take it to. we take Montreal to be the unit of analysis, or Quebec, or Canada, or whatnot, because we have free elections. But you highlight the literature on energy democracy as an illustration of democratic control. And so by highlighting that, you seem to indicate that you mean much more than free and fair election. And so, for instance, Suleki, in the paper that you cited, proposes to understand, and I quote Suleki, to understand energy democracy as an ideal political goal in which the citizens are the recipients and stakeholders of the entire energy sector policy. Governance in energy democracy should be characterized by wide participation of informed, aware, and responsible political subjects in an inclusive and transparent decision-making process relating to energy choices with the public good at its goal. So, of course, if we go back to your main argument, so that's a much more, of course, exacting standard, right? It demands much more. And if we go back to your main argument, then this may end up making the principle of responsibility inapplicable in most cases. So I'm going to go very quickly to the two non-anthropomorphic values, nature's intrinsic value and the moral status of animals. And I guess my question here is simply, how do those values fit in the overall conceptual framework that you use, which is one of a theory of distributive justice? So in the SCP, so let's take the two, and I'll be very quick. Let's take first the intrinsic value of nature. In the SCP entry, you say something that's very clear, and you say that climate ethics includes more than justice. And that's, of course, that's great. So there are, so confronting the challenges of climate change, justice plays a large role, but other kinds of moral considerations can also be relevant. But how do they fit together? Supporting the idea that nature has an intrinsic value is bound to have an impact on how to think about issues of climate justice, since some options will have to be taken off the table. Now, if I take the second non-anthropomorphic, the moral status of animals, if we accept that non-human animals have moral standing, then arguably we could and perhaps should include them within our theory of climate justice. In the same way that Will Klimica and Sue Donaldson have shown in Zoopolis how we could and should include non-human animals within a liberal theory of citizenship, then we could try to elaborate a theory of climate justice that includes consideration of non-human animal. This would have far-ranging consequences on how we consider the burdens related to climate change and what the fair distribution of the costs involved in a just transition should look like. So I'd like to have your thoughts on that. And then finally, and I'm concluding, I was just surprised. I was just surprised at the fact that you chose to tackle the issue of climate justice essentially at the level of states and not at the global level, since you've been a major contributor to that. C'est mon téléphone. So because you've been a major contributor to that literature, and you write, you conclude by saying that you think that a just transition to a sustainable world is feasible within states. Yeah. So is it because you don't think that it's feasible between states? Thank you.
So, Simon, would you like to respond?
Yeah, can I say a few things?
Yeah, I won't. And then we'll have the question.
That wonderful set of comments, and yeah, a lot of good points there. I won't try and deal with all of them, but let me just try and deal with a few that I was jotting down. So but the first I think is really, really important, which is about the state, and I listed all of these actors And one response might be, yeah, but ultimately the state has the responsibility to ensure that those within its purviews, so the building companies, the fossil fuel companies, etc., the banks, they're the unifying agent. It's the job of the state to ensure that this is in line. And I think that's true, but there are two things that you can pause here. So one is states just often lack capacity, just cannot control these institutions. And I think I've become more and more persuaded of this the more political science I read, especially the literature on state capacity. And you know, the American state in some ways is an extraordinary phenomenon because it's quite internally weak, is the way I understand it. So there's a presupposition there about state capacity. But the other point I have is a point that Nozick once made, which is responsibility is not a zero sum. And I think he said, or he might have been a later person, it's not a bucket, but if you take some out, then there's less left in. So you might think, yeah, ultimately the state take responsibility for the bank's jurisdiction investing. But that does not mean that the banks don't bear responsibility and liability. So there's plenty to be shared around. So then when we still have this multiplicity of central agents who could be held liable. And that's what I think, even if the state did have the capacity, it's not exonerate the banks from doing this, and if they lose money as a result of it, I think that's just. But I ought to say that. I ought to say that. And yeah, I didn't really think about it in this way, but you're absolutely right. So when I say responsibility cannot be treated in isolation and even in a more general theory, that is an integrationist point. It wasn't how I was thinking of it when I was writing it, but yeah. But the way I think about it is, I mean, just take Henry Shue. And so Henry is, you know, pioneering writer on climate, but his first book was on why everyone has, you know, a human right to a decent socioeconomic standard of living. I think a very powerful argument. If you find that persuasive, then you cannot endorse a distribution of climate responsibilities that then pushes people to a decent minimum. And you just have to stay true to these other commitments. And so I think it would be really implausible then to do anything other than supplement responsibility. I suppose that is an integrationist point, but in a way it's saying these other arguments for socioeconomic rights that you're having, then they cannot be compromised in the way that an isolation is doing. And so, yeah, I think that's another way of getting to the same point. Okay, maybe three other things, and then I will. You said something about compensation people having a right to be suspicious, and I just wanted to go back a bit because that is exactly right, and that's what this is particularly about. There's a great book on the transition in the US and talking about compensation, which is a fundamental challenge is people do not trust the government will actually deliver on it. And so that's the way that Gaston Murray and Tingley argue. It's by going and talking to people from coal country and lots of other fossil fuel intensive areas of the country to see why they wouldn't be assured by this. And it's a really bleak picture in a way because you need, and it's really related to governing for the long term, which is one of my obsessions, is you need to trust in public institutions. You need to believe that they will in fact do. So that's very uppermost on my mind because lots of people have these nice pictures of distributing to compensate, but it means nothing if the would-be recipients just don't believe that they will get that compensation. And that leads on to your next thing about the relationship between political and social science, which is something I really, really think a lot about. But I'm not going to answer quite what you put, which is what's the role of political philosophy. What I want to tell political philosophers is we all ought to read a lot more political science, because otherwise I think we ask the wrong questions. We assume people have this mental image of who the causal agents are. And I think we come up with, I've got a chapter on this, where we come up with malformed, badly formulated questions if we don't really understand the causal picture. So and for political scientists could benefit from reading some political philosophy, but I really think that philosophers will read a lot more political science because we have mental images of how problems are structured that may not bear up, and if we ask the wrong questions, then we get irrelevant answers. So it's a little bit like remember debates about world poverty, and someone says, "I'm really bothered about world poverty. How much should I give to charity?" And that assumes that the problem is one to do with donating money, and we need a richer empirical picture to ask the right question there. So it's a bit of a hobby horse of mine that I won't go into, but yeah, I suppose I think political philosophy would do well to read as much social science as they can. Then there was two final things, and then I will. Yeah, I do endorse the kind of picture that Zuleki and others propose. I do think it would have to be quite a radical democracy. And it leads to something I didn't say that is implicit in it. So people often ascribe responsibility to the citizens of a state, and they say, your state did it, you should be held liable. And I'm very nervous about that because often I think states, this can only be true if states meet certain conditions, which is they're conducted in terms of political equality, there's genuine inclusion, corporate actors are not writing the legislation, and it has to be a we, where we say, we agreed this. But where we don't have that, and where there's political inequality, where the policies are made by some, and others are excluded, where the downsides always fall on the same group of people, I think they're entitled to say, well, we didn't agree to this at all, you agreed to this, and we're not liable to that. And the controversial implication of this is I'm pretty skeptical about lots of claims of historical responsibility for emissions being ascribed to contemporary citizens, because I think if we had a well-functioning political system and we're all included in it and it makes a decision, I think fair enough, I'm liable for that. The reality is, it's an ideal theory of the state that never exists. So to tell African Americans that, yeah, they're liable for what the state did 50 years ago because we did it as a community. I just think it is it's sort of playing into a myth. So yeah, it really has to be then, and that has quite significant implications for who should pay now. I don't think establishment of citizens or a unit really meaningful if they didn't have a meaningful input into the process. And this makes me think that someone like Iris Marion Young was kind of right in a way when she said, I don't want backward-looking principles. I think her reasons are different, but I think backward-looking principles might not be applicable in those cases where you've got these structures with no one really in charge. And then we maybe just have to socialize those costs and distribute them. So I'm flagging up something that's really controversial in what I said that might have been visible, which is I'm skeptical of descriptions of liability to citizens for what their states have done, unless quite strict conditions are met. I better stop there in the interest of discourse and conversation. But thank you so much.
So I'm sure there will be plenty of questions now. S'il y a des questions, if there are questions online also, you can raise your hand on Zoom and I'll try to monitor it. Et on va ici, là. Une ici, puis là, puis là. Il y a quatre.
Oui, thank you, Simon. This was great. On the democracy value, maybe you discussed this in the paper, but you seem to focus mostly on how democracy is important. The reasons about democracy are important to determine levels of liability or attribution of responsibility to people. So the less democratic a society is, the less in one respect we should be confident in assigning, attributing responsibility to people. Which is fine. But I wonder, there's another dimension of this value, which I think may be important to your project. And it is the more democracy there is in society, the better in a way the process of transition is going, because there's an intrinsic value in people ruling themselves democratically. So using the distinction that outcome and comprehensive outcome, imagine two paths towards a sustainable future. both are equally good in terms of what they achieve at the end of the road, but one is achieved through democratic, more democratic processes than the other. So there's a respect in which the first transition is better, it's more just. So this is not a criticism. It's just maybe you have that in the text, but it may be worth adding to your marshalling of the value of democracy, illuminating what a just transition is.
Yeah, no, thank you. It is it's part of the chapter on cosmopolitanism, and it is in there, but I didn't say it, and I think it's really important, especially for some hard cases. So we want to build these wind farms in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in Mexico. Should that go ahead or not? Well, the only way to do it their way is to have a democratic decision on whether it's a collective phenomenon there, whether it goes ahead under what terms and so on. And the local communities there have many foundations banded together. They object to colonialism. That's just saying this is what's going to happen. That's all there. So actually, I think there's three reasons, and I only mentioned one. The reason one is that there has to be an agent that's held liable, that isn't a functional role. Reason two is the one that you rightly pointed out. And reason three is I do think there's instrumental reasons for doing it, which is form of innovation and experimentation, and other units can then learn by seeing what was tried in one. So, yeah, your three reasons for instrumental intrinsic in. Yeah, thank you. I should have said that.
Yeah, I have a less sophisticated version of Pablo's question. But if you could you bring back the 5 values at the end of your talk?
The timeline.
Well, it doesn't matter.
I'll get that.
It's about democracy too. It seems that okay.
There's a 5.
So in the one on democracy, it seems that the crucial aspect of the sentences is control over the structural determinants of people's emissions.
Yeah.
Suppose you have an enlightened tyrant or a group of enlightened tyrants that uphold the principles of responsibility, equality, liberty, and honor, anthropocentric values. Why do they need to be democratic?
Ask your neighbor. I think that's. So I agree with. I think that's a good way of thinking about it. So one reply I would give, in my third instrumental one, is epistemically, it's not a possible scenario, but only if you include those affected with their knowledge and experience will you actually get a good outcome. Suppose that's that's an empirical claim. Suppose that's not true. But I do think something is and what's lost is an idea of collective autonomy that people are unloading their lives. And I suppose it's just a collective version of the individual level. You could do it at the individual level. We could say, look, there are lots of ways of doing it, but I'm going to tell you exactly how you're going to do it, what food you're going to eat, and so on. And so I think, I just think that's a legitimate experience with the autonomy of the agent, individual or collective.
Right.
Yeah.
But wouldn't that be a problem that is independent from your argument? And that would be indeed a problem of justice if you violate the autonomy, but it would that be something against claiming that you can enforce climatic justice or transition without the democratic conditions? So it wouldn't. I could agree with you that that would violate autonomy, but that doesn't affect my other claim that a transition would be just even if it's not democratic.
Yeah, I think where we might slightly go into a semantic debate, and I would say, no, I think that would be an unjust transition, and you might then say, no, it'd be just, but look, objectionable in some other way. And would you say it would be objectionable? Yeah. Then I think we're in agreement on what ought to be done and the values, and I might be saying it's kind of a just transition, and but then I do feel there'll be sort of overall disagreement. So yeah, and I think I should have really said what Pablo said, because I think that's really important for lots of things, and we were talking about last week, really prior and informed. But so for lots of initiatives, I think when it affects the community at large, it's really important to have this UN type framework of free, prior and informed consent for it to be just or legitimate. So and I think you agree that's an important value. Yeah.
I hope so.
Il y a plusieurs questions, mais Claude, puis après j'ai une question sur Zoom, je donnerai la parole à Eric Pinault, et puis après je reprendrai, il y avait ici, et puis, ah non, c'était ici, voilà, ici, Mathias, et là, voilà. Alors Claude.
Thank you very much. This really nicely illustrates both the interest and the difficulty of trying to think these issues in a global, synthetic way. My question is about, well, it's in the line of some of the points that have been raised by Dominic and the others. Responsibility looms large in your analysis approach, and you listed different kinds of agents. Responsibility goes along with agency. You listed, banks, firms, unions, governments. And of course, one might think that some of these are not genuine agents. To be an agent, a responsible agent, one must be able to suffer from the consequences, to be punished somehow. And suppose that you have a firm that as a result of some ecological policy is held responsible and it goes into bankrupt, but no one, cares because no one financially suffers about it. Every investor has a way to get out of it. So my point is that really we get down to individuals at some point, or maybe groups of individuals, that is collective agents. So my question is, actually I have two questions. Do you agree that it all boils down to responsibility of individuals and collective agents? And if so, could you say more about how you think of collective agents?
Those are really good questions, and I don't know that I fully thought through the answers to them. So I think it doesn't matter to me, it doesn't have to be a necessary condition for an agent that they can suffer and feel pain, but it does matter that for these purposes, that they have financial resources. And so if there's a corporate actor that's made a lot of money from oil exploration and has huge financial assets as a result of that, and that's of interest for my argument, because we need those financial resources to invest in renewable and maybe for investing in green jobs and so on. And so the fact that they can't suffer isn't, if anything, it's a positive thing, right? The really relevant thing is there's a lot of money and they can't complain if that's taken away from them. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about some of these factors. But then the effects will ripple down on human beings. And so what I'm tempted by is the thought that you can punish, not punish, that's the wrong word. You can tax something like Total Energies or BP or Chevron or Exxon Mobil, but not the workers who are currently employed under it. So you might take away all the profit margins and all the assets, but invest in other kinds of industry. This is horrendously much more difficult than I'm making it sound. Like those people could be re-employed. And so it's tackling the corporation, but not harming the most of the individuals is what I'm aiming at. And so you might wonder, is that a bit fanciful? Is it possible to do both? And I suppose I don't see why you can't do that. I mean, the people who will suffer there is those who maybe have got lots of money invested in that corporation, or maybe the managerial class who draw high salaries from it, and just all the amount of money. But that's how I'm trying to think of hurting firms, but not individuals. But I need to think more about whether that's a realistic picture. I actually share the thought that I think you're articulating there. I'm not projecting my worries into you. When people say, oh, I think the state should pay, and I think, what do you really mean that? What they really mean is contemporary citizens should pay. And I think the British should be upfront and honest and say, when you're saying, I think the British state should pay now for emissions in the 19th century, you're saying, well, current British citizens should pay for what people in the 19th century did. Be honest and be upfront. So I think I've got you right. I'm sort of articulate. I have a similar kind of thought about how people anthropomorphize the state as if it's a separate actor with no impact on individuals. And I think, let's just be honest there. So everything then does depend on whether you can do what I just described, which is redistribute resources from the companies, but protect individuals like those workers who need jobs.
On va essayer de prendre une question sur Zoom. Est-ce que tu peux essayer de formuler ta question?
Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Oui, c'est bon, on t'entend.
Super, ben merci. Désolé de ne pas être là. Sorry, Simon, for not being here today in person, but I was here all the way through, listening in. Thanks for the great discussion. I have two questions and one small remark, and I'll try to go quickly through them. The first one is, given your analysis of, I'm looking at the 5 conditions that you put forward. What are the implications for this for the way we measure GHG emissions, which has a really important impact on the way we responsibilize societies today and in the future? Since Kyoto, we've been measuring them at the production level. We've been doing production-based accounts. Does your proposal imply in some way that we should shift to consumption-based accounts? And if we do, at what level should they be examined? Should we open up the box of countries and move down one level? And what are the implications? So that's one. The second one is looking at fossil fuel sector workers. You talked a lot about them. And you don't have to answer all these questions. I'm just throwing them in. One thing that I've been struggling with working in Canada is the fact that when we look at how we transition away these workers from the fossil fuel sector, one issue is that they ask for full compensation of their wages. They want to be transferred to a sector where they can make the they can keep their buying power, their spending power. The problem in this is that their wages include a huge chunk of resource rents. And is this fair? And this resource rent is basically a big harm, right? It's based on a big harm. So is this fair? And I think, looking at other workers that will not benefit in the transition, like care workers, which are underpaid. So, how do we work with this normatively? And then the last is not a question, it's more of a comment, but there was discussion about the fact that ending slavery in the UK implied buying off slave owners. And this did work in the UK. And it's a good analogy sometimes used for fossil fuel sector interests. Now, one has to remember that in the US, it didn't work out that way. They tried that for about 10 years. And then what really worked was a civil war. And what's the difference between the UK and the US? It's that in the UK, the slavery system was peripheral in the 19th century, right? It wasn't as central. It was central in the 17th century, but in the 18th century and in the 19th century, it became more and more peripheral. Whereas in the US, it was a core component of the economic arrangements in the South. So I asked the question, given that it's the corporation today that is the owner of these assets, what does a civil war against corporations imply? What form would that take?
You only ask small questions, Eric. Thank you. Let me have a quick think about. So the first one, I'm not sure what I think, but my initial thought actually goes in the slightly opposite direction to what you said. So often, the benefit of everyone here, doesn't know this. The way economists sometimes look at it is they look at consumption and look at emissions in terms of who's consuming what resources, and sometimes they look at who's producing it. And my initial thought on it was this would downplay the emphasis on consumption emissions, because someone might say to the consumer, you're liable for these products. They might say, I've got really little choice in what I've got very little say over this. The energy supply is being dictated by the government, which is making solar, wind, and everything else. So you can maybe hold me liable as a citizen, though I'm skeptical of that, but as a consumer, I have so little agency that it's inappropriate, and really the action should be on the productive process. That's my initial thought, but then someone might say at the productive process, we don't actually have a huge amount of agency and choice there either, and then I'm still thinking through what follows from that. That might be the language of responsibility just doesn't get purchased in those cases because no one has much agency. Okay, that's thought number one. Thought number two, so what if the people in the fossil fuel dependent industries actually have pretty high wages and they say, I demand something comparable to that? I think this is why you need, not you, one needs a normative framework here, because it might have been that their previous it's too high and they're just not entitled to that. And so I do favour a more equal society, but if they're more than equal amount earlier, they can't pay. I have a right to maintain that inequality. But that's sort of my rough answer on that. I mean, politically, this is where the broom type view might get traction. It might be it's necessary to pay people over the odds to create the coalition. But as a matter of justice, someone says the average salary is X and I demand 2X. I think, well, really interesting, but you have no claim. And the third one, I'm gonna leave that one open because I don't know what to think about it. Transition agreement, transition pathways and conflict, and what form that has to take. So I agree, I should say doesn't mention the slavery, but some people do, and without a sense of embarrassment or uncomfortableness. It is that it was necessary for it to happen. And I guess I'm skeptical we need anything like that. But the more moderate claim that we might need unfair levels of compensation might be true. I just don't know. I hope we don't need a civil war.
So we have several questions here already, so let's well, first.
My first question has to do with collective agent and contribution of unorganized collective agents, consumers and the people who put money in the banks, people who elect politicians who say they're prioritize economic growth and so forth. And my second question has to do with the last point about global level.
Yeah.
I'm also with concerned the forward-looking responsibilities, but since it's going on at the national level about how to go forward with climate justice. What should I do?
Thank you. I mean, so on collective agency and collective responsibility, I guess I think we're in an uncomfortable situation, which is there are structural causes that no responsible collective agent marshalling those. So then I'm trying to follow if the model of responsibility doesn't fit those cases. So I was thinking in a forward-looking way, we ought to make sure that there is an accountable, functioning, responsible agent who can say, look, you're responsible. But absent that, I don't know that responsibility arguments get purchase. So that does bring me closer to someone like Iris Marignon. I think she's much too sweeping in her disregard for historical. And I do think some of these cases, there are agents that are doing this. I mean, I do think things like total MVP are collective agents that have persisted through time, that are thwarted and undermined. And the good work by Naomi Oreskes and Jeffrey Supran and others on this. But sometimes things just happen because of a constellation of other discrete processes coming into action. And then I think my own view then is that we need to move on from something other than responsibility there. And I would just socialize those costs and say they have to be borne. And the right way to do it is from each according to their ability to pay. And one way to think about this is think about the COVID pandemic. I mean, some people do want to point the finger at various agents and say, it was them, it was that lab leak, maybe it was irresponsible management there. But we may never know, and in a way, I'm not that interested in it. I think the common response then was there's a problem here, and we could both socialize the cost. And in some societies, the thought is, well, those with the deepest pockets should pay. That's the right response there. So that we move on to equality. Do you think that's a counterintuitive kind of verdict, or?
Equality, sorry.
Well, to say responsibility just doesn't really apply here because there isn't an agent who can plausibly describe
So I think
responsibility.
I read a lot of articles. It depends on what we mean by responsibility. And responsibly, from what I heard from the lecture, is very similar to liability.
Yeah.
And it's written this, I think. So according to your use, right? We are allowed to move away from the line of responsibility and socialize the costs there.
Yeah, I would like, I mean, so I think she runs together liability and blame. I think it's supposed to say these agents are liable, but they may not be blaming but they should bear the costs. But the bit I kind of was, I think in the spirit of her is thinking, sometimes thinking in that backward-looking way doesn't apply. I think sometimes she just thinks it's politically divisive and unfruitful, which might be true, but that's not really what I'm saying. I just don't think there's an agent here we can ascribe, or even a group of agents, and then you need some other principle. And then I kind of think, well, it's a phrase that got horribly used in the UK by government support that said, oh, we're all in it together, and then we have to think, what's the fairest way of dealing with this collective challenge? And that's where my answer is something like, well, it's an egalitarian way of doing it. There's ability, but what else might have a different principle? One quick, kind of just very quick thing on global, because it's just to say, I suppose, I just think these values should be writ large globally. Probably my examples were more domestic, but some of them were to do with things like an electric vehicle that will have implications for lithium in Chile, or it might have implications for cobalt in the DRC. So I didn't talk about global institutions, but if you're right, I think they're globally. It might be.
Matthias.
Yes, thank you so much. I just wanted to come back briefly to the question of democracy that Dominique raised. So if I understood correctly, then, so you're saying there's structural limits to individual responsibilities, and that's why we need democracy. First of all, that sounds instrumental, but I think that was basically what Pablo already raised. And he said, I don't mean for the democratic value to be merely instrumental to individual responsibility. So you are in favor of, an account of democracy that makes it an intrinsic value of some sort. So collective self-determination. Then I wonder whether you might want to tie it to liberty. So that would be one way of going there. So that's sort of a friendly amendment or a suggestion how maybe you could tighten it up a little bit. But then I have another question about democracy, because it seemed that when you start out with, okay, so there are structural limits to individual responsibility, and then these structural limits, the capitalist economy seems to figure very large in it. So the banks finance capital, misinformation by ExxonMobil, they've known this for 40 years, and all this stuff that you're aware of and that you talk about. And so then it poses the question of the relationship between democracy and the capitalist economy.
Yeah. You can't get to that, but yeah. So no, that's good. That's right. And this was what I was thinking was, if you've got a series of causal structures, from an instrumental point of view, it's important to democratize that. And I think sometimes at the relevant level will be the city. So the city can decide whether it's going to have prohibition of using cars in the city, or whether there's a system like in London and other cities in the UK where you can only go and pay a fee. Or you might have some other arrangement, but there's agency at the city level. But there's some of the other causal factors. If you kind of look down on it, and you might think, actually, that pattern is like national and level. And then, it's conceivable other patterns will actually be transnational. And I suppose I just think at each level where you just see the knot of tight causal relations, there should be a political structure on that. So then if things are escaping, that's where, as I say, they should be decided with city level, and someone said, that's ridiculous, because the structures transcend the city. And okay, let's go to the next level. And then someone says the state, and then someone else says, no, they transcend the state. I think, oh, really, we have to go to the next level. So I didn't bring that out, but that's kind of how I think about it. And in democratic theory terms, I am kind of in it's very niche, but sort of all affected, all subjective kind of territory. It says if you're subject to the coercive powers, or if you're affected in significant ways involuntarily, then you have a right to a say. So yeah, we just have to go as high as is necessary to follow these forces, and we've not the of alien forces. Marx wants to put it. Does that answer? Is that logically a fit?
Yeah, yes.
I mean, it might be utopian, right?
There's a question.
Yeah, I wanted to come back on the discussion on liberty, and I feel pretty much like as a sociologist, when I read this version of liberty as persons should live within their fair limits, I understand that this version of liberty is very close to a liberal one, where liberty pretty much equates here liberty to consume. So liberty in the market, but I feel that individual liberty as consume as you will in a market that is not free at all. Like this, the illusion of a free market, but the market is pretty much bounded in structure of like very hierarchical, production systems, etc. And I'm wondering if this liberty of because that the responsibility of how to consume on the individual, whether maybe the liberty of the market is a determinant factor, where maybe we should bound instead of bounding the liberty to consume, maybe we should understand that the liberty to produce, or the liberty, maybe it should be the thing that should be tackled first, and it's linked also to the liberty to produce, to consume as well. So, for example, like in New Zealand, I think they say if you're born after, I don't remember the date, but 2010, you're not allowed to consume cigarettes. It's not about like saying you can bound a market, or like one of the liberties that we have in this society that is most of people say it's undeniable. It's the liberty to consume a personal car. So how could you bound this thing? And it goes to like a second aspect of the question, which is like the idea that democracy, is a central value, but this democracy is not bound to the material responsibility of this choice. So if you ask most of individuals, they will agree that the fact that they should be allowed to consume a car, but they don't take the responsibility of like the climate change that is going to be like the consequence of this liberty. So maybe a critique of democracy understood as like public sphere decision in the Habermasian terms is saying, how could that be linked to the material consequences of how the choices are made? So, for example, one of the part of the discussion in energy communities, for example, right now, is saying people should exert democracy on how, for example, energy systems are made, because they are bound to a material system they pertain to, not as something abstract that they will live the direct consequence of how they decide how their energy should be managed, for example, on their own territory. And that's very different than saying democracy should be exerted at the national level, where people don't see the material consequences of what they decide finally. So,
yeah, I think when I say liberty, I don't mean really do whatever I want. It's just liberty. So, so the point then is, someone says, I have a right to a car, or I have a right to 10 overseas holidays, or whatever. You don't, right? It's got to be liberty within the limits of justice. And so if you just think about there being limits, what I think is, if there was only one way we could actually comply with those limits, then it would be regrettable that everyone would have to do exactly the same thing. But that's not the case, right? There are just different ways of people living sustainable lives within limits, and that's all I'm saying. So it's not a right in the market sense. It's not a right to drive a car. It's not a right to air conditioning. People can assert these rights if they want to, but they don't have them. What they have is the right to be their own person in a sustainable way. And what I suppose I'm pushing against is people who are very doctrinaire and say, no, you must do it exactly this way. So the example I gave was procreation, and people saying, no, that anything else is impermissible other than having 0.5 of a child. If you and I think I don't think any case has been made, because with that being true, you'd have to say, no, there's no other possible way to living sustainably than doing that. And I think there isn't a plausible empirical case. But even if there were, I think, well, there'd be something lost there, right? That people's right to do as they wish with their body within limits. So I just wonder if there's like maybe some disciplinary differences in the way we use words. And so when I mean liberty, I don't mean limitless. I mean liberty within the limits of justice. I mean, there's another issue that's on my mind, but it's complicated. So let's talk about plant-based diets. So I don't think people should eat meat or fish and so on and so forth. And someone might think, no, that the only way to be sustainable is for everyone to have a plant-based diet. I don't believe those things should be forced. So it may be inconsistent on wrong, but I don't think it's an enforceable ones there. So but I know lots of friends and colleagues and just think, no, they should be prohibited. And I think, well, there's a loss there, a loss of liberty. So that's what's on my mind. I just think different ways of living sustainably, we should respect that difference, but that doesn't mean allowing people to live unsustainably or insist they have a right to drive a car. Actually, on things about cars, I think the right thing to think is, why do people like cars? Well, they might think I value mobility. Well, why do you value mobility? I just want to always go down to the most basic thing and see why do we need it? So people tend to fetishize the current mode of realizing certain goals. And then you might think that those goals can be realized in other better sustainable ways. So I don't think people have a right to a car when you come up or to drive a car. It depends on what the underlying value is and whether that's the only or best way of realizing it. Maybe to be continued.
All right. Avec ça, je pense qu'on va arrêter ici. Ça commence à sentir bon, non? C'est parce qu'il y a le lunch qui est arrivé. Donc, on va remercier à nouveau Simon Caney.